It's very severe and it is unfortunately deteriorating, and we are having to plan for a very sharp increase in the humanitarian needs as the expectation of the recovery of Mosul is in train. So put that together, we have something in the order of 10 to 12 million people at risk, and we have some millions in various parts who have humanitarian needs tonight, and we can see that we are able to reach many of them, but by no means all of them. And some of the access routes are blocked because of violence, some because they are in areas which are currently controlled by so-called ISIL, and others because we have yet to be able to secure the supply chains and to get the funding to be able to ensure that we have sufficient to meet all the needs of all the people who need water, food, shelter, emergency medical assistance, and the ability to be able to move of their own free will should they wish to. Well, one of the things which has really been very noticeable in the whole of this very long, protracted crisis, and let's not forget, it's a man-made crisis. All humanitarian needs that come out of conflict are man-made. So the primary and the best humanitarian response is for the guns to fall silent, for there to be no conflict. But we have to plan for where that does not take place. And one of the things which has been very clear, whether it's to do with funding or the access issues, has been that in the past in Iraq, looking in the totality of Iraq, the people with humanitarian needs have been broadly served by the government of Iraq, by the Kurdistan regional government authorities, by the areas that have been able to secure a lot of NGO support, and the UN through its agencies and through the Office of Coordination, which I head up, have been able to support what has been that delivery mechanism for people in need. It's also been very responsive because, of course, as you can imagine, the needs move depending on what's happening in terms of front lines, who is with an upper hand or not, and we saw that when there was the change in control in Fallujah, where there was a scattering to the four corners, and then we had to be picking up the pieces, ensuring access routes, shelter, as well as medical, food, water. And what's changed is now the UN and its agencies and humanitarian partners, these are regarded as being the primary deliverers, partly because we've got severe economic challenges in all parts of Iraq, and because there has been this continuing anxiety about the ability to deliver. So this is what's changed, and is putting enormous pressure on the donors when they try to assess how can they best help. Of course, their generosity can't be called into question. It's an enormously generous thing. We've recently had another fundraising in America, in Washington, to try and raise money, and that's been well funded. But the question is translating those pledges into the actual programs for humanitarian support, as well as stabilization and the other things. Well, I think we have to be really clear that when the operation, and we can see some of the peripheral areas now already being engaged in a recovery program as it's being described, when it gets to the main conurbation of Mosul, we have some indication, and as humanitarians we have to prepare for when the consequences of what's going to take place will produce needs of food and water and shelter, but also protection. And I can see very clearly that you'll get very large numbers of people on the move. We would expect something in the region of over 70,000 families. This is potentially near 500,000 people finding they're fleeing towards the Erbil direction. So this will be primarily a big concern for everybody in the Erbil area to make sure that they can step up to their fraternal responsibilities to give people who are fleeing safety and succour. And that will be very important, but at the same time, perhaps going westwards, you'll have some of the ISIL fighters fleeing, and so you will have another scattering. But we also know there will probably be a retention of possibly as many as 200,000 people or so in the centre of Mosul, which will be very difficult for all those who are trying to ensure operations don't put people at even further risk than they're already suffering. And the uncertainty and the fear, of course, will have a major effect upon the humanitarian, not because, of course, with food and shelter and all the things you would expect, but also because of protection. This is to do with women and girls who have been appallingly subjected to gender and sexual-based violence by women who have been very seriously abused generally and into a modern type of slavery. You've also got men and boys who have been against their will recruited or abducted to try and be persuaded to join fights which are none of their volition, and indeed have been subjected also to appalling sexual violence as well, which is often not spoken about. So I think that we are dealing with people who will be deeply traumatized, and where the services will go beyond purely protection and the commodities of life, but also there will need to be a very specialized psychosocial support for many people. And so I do see this as being something we have to prepare for, and prepare for both urgently and well. We're very well planned. We have got very good people on the ground today. They're working extremely well and closely with all the authorities across all the relevant parts of Iraq. And we are as well planned as we can be for something which we cannot be sure how it is going to take place, when it is going to take place, and precisely where it will take place. So humanitarian needs very much arise out of the actions, particularly the violence and the fighting, and of course you have innocent civilians and many others who are caught up in this, who need the assistance and support. So yes, we're very well prepared. In terms of the money, you mentioned 47-48% funded is what the current humanitarian response plan has managed to attract, relative around the world to all the various humanitarian plans that we have, calling upon the generosity of the international community to support us in humanitarian action. That is not a bad statistic, but let's be clear, that's still below half of what we believe already we have assessed that we need. And yet we can see with the potential for the fight and battle for Mosul, we can see that that's going to have to be revised upwards, whichever way you look at it. So that will mean that less of a proportion of what we need is actually funded. Now, the international community is coming together, it's talking about this a lot, it is well prepared, it is thinking about the resources necessary to support the programs. The design of the programs, the coordination and the marshalling of the UN agencies in terms of the relevant work that they can offer to make sure that we meet people's needs, the protection and the way that we make sure that the routes, safe routes for flight, of those who wish voluntarily to take off and to flee, to make sure that we're doing our best to give people protection if they decide to stay put, and to meet the immediate needs of people. So we have various phases of planning to try and then match whatever phases of the actions on the ground, the facts on the ground as they develop, emerge. And that really is what we can do. We've got very strong leadership in terms of the UN in Iraq, particularly the humanitarian coordinator is extraordinarily experienced and has been very, very active in producing the relevant information well ahead of time. It's very rare that we have this sense of predictability about the scenarios of what we may have to face. And I take my hat off to her for her ability to have marshalled the world's thinking into getting ready for what we can see is coming straight down the track at us. Well, the money that was raised was very much to support the Iraqi people, to meet the needs that they have, particularly as the areas of conflict go through and they are then left either having fled or their homes are needing repair or where they don't have access to the basic commodities of life or need emergency medical treatment. So I am anticipating that a good proportion of that money would be very focused on stabilization and on seeking to help secure what has become a new settlement once the recovery of areas which have previously been controlled by the so-called ISIS movement has happened. Now, that means that of the 2 billion or so, maybe about $500 million will be most specifically allocated towards humanitarian, which is to meet immediate needs, and the rest would be perhaps a little bit more invested in the early recovery, development and stabilization that you would expect in order to try and underpin not only people's survival, but their ability to survive in a sustainable way. So that would also underpin livelihoods. Of course, it takes time for that money to go from being pledged to converting to cash to then buying programs. And I think it's fair to say, although we have, as I've mentioned before, made huge preparations, in normal times it would take about 2.5 months to go from knowing we've got the money to actually being able to implement directly on the ground to the people in need. Now, of course, we can foreshorten that very, very speedily if we need to, depending on the facts, but of course it puts up the cost, and so your reach over time is obviously affected because the unit cost of reaching people in need goes up if you have to very, very rapidly accelerate it rather than have a much more planned distribution. And of course it really matters that you have access so that you can be sure that when you are delivering these very vital commodities, that you are genuinely meeting the needs of people in need. Need is our only measure. We're not partial, we're always impartial, always neutral, always independent. And it's very important that we don't get sucked into any side of a fight or indeed supplying these commodities to people who actually don't have those vital humanitarian needs. Being discussed at the moment, but in essence, the decision as to how the money gets allocated is being delegated to the UN from those who have been generous enough to come together to raise the money, because they see that as being the best way to ensure the impartiality. And particularly when you're dealing with a country which is an immediate, or parts of a country which are an immediate post-conflict, you have to be extraordinarily careful because there are still people who are remembering all too vividly the terrible suffering, the terrible fight that they've been in. And many people, of course, were not engaged one side or the other, but there were many combatants and ex-combatants who were. And it takes time for a healing process to take place. And we don't want the money that has been raised for humanitarian needs or for early recovery or for stabilization and for getting people back on their feet, or indeed to help them return to their homes to make sure they have sufficient shelter or shoes on their children's feet or emergency medical care. You don't want that to be allocated in such a way as would make it appear as though one side had either won, the other lost, or that it was being particularly favoured one against the other, because the only measure for us is meeting needs. We have to make an assessment, who has the needs, however it arose, wherever it arose, whenever it arose. That doesn't matter. It matters only that there are people who have needs that need to be met. And that's why we look at Iraq as clearly, rightly, a whole country. It is the member state, and the UN, of course, is characterised by being a member state organisation. So that is the starting point for us to ensure our neutrality and to keep our focus on doing what we have to do, which is to meet the humanitarian needs, rather than to find ourselves drawn to one side of any kind of partial dispute or another. Well, I'm very conscious that wherever people generously offer shelter and refuge to people who are fleeing or in need. It doesn't matter where they are or to whom they owe their allegiance. We should celebrate and salute them for their selfless protection and their particularly generous approach to making sure that people are looked after in their time of need. It's exactly as you would expect and hope would happen to you should it happen. So that is, I think, not a distinction. What is a distinction is that the United Nations is made up of member states. That's how it is constituted. The values that were set up immediately following the Second World War were stated in a charter which has very much stood the test of time for over 70 years now, but it is very much based upon member states. Of course, it's challenged whenever people want to think about borders afresh, for instance, or whatever. But that is not something that the United Nations can either lead or demonstrate any kind of partiality, particularly if you are the humanitarian arm of the United Nations. We have very, very clear principles we have to operate by. And international humanitarian law, both the traditional law that's been guardianed in Geneva since the 1860s, but also as enshrined by the United Nations Charter of Values, and particularly the resolution that was in the early 90s, the source of what sets up the big humanitarian activity of the United Nations, something which we all are engaged with and which I think the rest of the world feels very strongly is a very important part of what we would expect to see the United Nations do, both in terms of coordination, marshalling resources and delivery. And you know the big agencies that do that and working with humanitarian partners. All that is done in the name and at the request of the member states, all 193 of them, who come together and pass resolutions and indeed both raise and vote the regular money, but as it happens, the humanitarians have to go out and raise each year. It's part of my job to help marshal the resources in what is called extra budgetary. So the answer to your question is not because it is either a choice or a partial thing. It is to demonstrate our impartiality, that our engagement is because of the way we are organised as the United Nations under the member states. But we have a particular responsibility as the humanitarians to operate in accordance with international humanitarian law and to make sure we're always impartial, neutral, independent and acting in the name of humanity. Our only test is to find, have access to and meet the needs of people who need either food, water, shelter, emergency medical treatment, both in situ or evacuated, and to make sure that we do everything we can to provide the protection for people who are vulnerable and in their time of need, and particularly for those who in man-made conflict situations, these humanitarian issues are arising, which also give rise to gender and sexual-based violence.